I welcome you all here today to the UN Sustainable Development Goals Forum. My name is Lynette Russell. I'm the Deputy Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts. I begin by having an acknowledgement of country. We meet today on the lands of the Kulin Nations, the people who lived here before us and continue their ongoing connection to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people. I'm delighted to be chair for this forum today because on behalf of Professor Jackie True, who is the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Arts. Jackie's been unwell for over a week now and is unable to speak today, but she has managed to join us as an attendee, so you might have to do sign language for her. This forum has been coordinated. This forum has been coordinated today by the Faculty of Arts and the Monash Sustainability Institute. It's designed to bring research leaders across the university together to investigate how research strengths at Monash University align with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. I'm pleased that we have such an incredible turnout given Melbourne has managed to turn on its very, very best spring weather. We've got representatives from MUARC, from the Faculty of Science, from Global Engagement, from the art, design and architecture. We've got law, IT, education, engineering, medicine, and of course, Faculty of Arts and MSI. I'm especially pleased that we can also welcome the Associate Deans of Research from the Faculties of Education, Engineering and Information Technology. They've all been able to take time out of their very busy schedules to join us today. And medicine. You're not on my list. You're not on my list. Look, we really hope today's event continues to foster the spirit of collaboration and interdisciplinary research at Monash, which we're actually renowned for. We're going to map ourselves against the UN sustainability goals and we're going to find out what it is we can achieve together. The format for today's forum has been outlined in your agenda, and I'd just like to begin. We'll be beginning with 3 presentations, and then we follow on with a workshop which Dave Griggs will be managing on how we might establish, or how to establish Monash can contribute to the solving of the Sustainable Development Goals and how we might leverage its position, our position at Monash, in the Australian Pacific Regional Centre of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I'm going to give you a few housekeeping matters to begin. First of all, if you've got any questions for the speakers, and if time allows, we'll actually field those at the end of the workshop, please. There are refreshments available in the foyer and indeed on some of the tables I see. The bathrooms are out through the foyer and to the right. You've been provided with a feedback form when you registered, and we really find these incredibly useful for planning purposes, but also for us taking stock of the sorts of things we do over the years. So please, if you could actually fill them in and return them to the registration table today, that we'd really appreciate that. So again, let me just say, we're really excited to engage with you in the exploration of potential research opportunities that are presented by the Sustainable Development Goals, and I look forward to this workshop and what our outcomes might be today. I'm going to begin now by having the great pleasure of introducing Sir Bob Watson. Sir Bob Watson is one of the world's leading experts on atmospheric science and global environmental issues, including climate change and ozone depletion. He's received many national and international awards and prizes for his contributions to science, and he's held leadership positions in NASA, the World Bank, UK Development of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the United Nations Environment Programme, World Meteorological Organisation, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Bob Watson.
Fine, I'm going to give about a 20-minute talk very quickly. There's about 40 slides, just to give you a flavour of what's going on. And so the first thing is I'm going to talk about the global situation as I see it, the international policy process, what type of sustainable development goals are being considered, what are some of the challenges, and then what's happening internationally just with respect to the issue of science and technology. So the global situation is clear. Totally unacceptable levels of poverty, income inequality, hunger, lack of access to clean water, modern energy. We have to deal with the fact that the population is still increasing. We've clearly got unsustainable production and consumption patterns. The economic system is totally bankrupt. and we are seeing rapid economic change. So, you know, a trivial little agenda to deal with. I was fortunate enough to win the Blue Planet Prize along with about, well, now there's been 40 people won it, and about 20 of us, a very eclectic group, actually put together, we had actually a vision, we actually had a dream, we called it a dream, of a world without poverty, a world that's equitable, it respects human rights, we have increased ethical behaviour, and we truly integrate the environmental, the social, and the economic strands of society. And we actually deal with the tough issues of climate change and biodiversity. But as we said, it's a totally achievable vision or dream, but the current system is deeply flawed, and the current pathway of development will not realise it in either developed or developing countries. So we said the time to act was now. We had 9 things that had to be done. This was an input to the Rio +20 conference. Clearly got to look at the issue of population, clearly got to look at the issue of resource efficiency. We must transition to a low carbon economy and adapt to climate change, and have one slide on each of these. We clearly need to look at the drivers of biodiversity loss and the degradation of ecosystem services. How do we get a viable way of looking at the economy? So we need to go beyond GDP. Clearly need to eliminate subsidies, create markets to pay for ecosystem services. Clearly need to deal with governance and the whole issue of eliminating or at least minimising the power of the vested interest. What's working at the grassroots level? The question is, can it be scaled? Is it replicable? And clearly the role of education, training, R&D, absolutely critical to the future. The population issue is fairly straightforward. We've known what to do since the Cairo conference in 1994. It is the education of girls, it's the empowerment of women, it's healthcare for the children and elderly, and it's making modern contraception accessible to all. We're currently at about 7 billion people. The best guess is it'll be 9.5 billion people by 2050, and potentially, hopefully, no more than that in 2100. There's a wide range. I personally don't believe a scenario that gets it under 6 billion people by 2100. I just don't see that scenario. But hopefully it's not the top scenario either of hitting 12 billion people. Clearly, we've got to break the link between economic growth, production and consumption, and environment. There is no dichotomy, in my opinion, some trade-offs, but no fundamental dichotomy between producing goods and services and effectively a clean environment. We've got to recognise there has to be some level of growth in the world to get the billion people in abject poverty out of poverty. At the same time, we have to recognise there are some potential limits for a fragile planet with our natural resources. So it's how do you balance that right? As I've already said, in the next slide talks about, we've got to get the economics right. Instead of using GDP as a measure of economic growth, we at least need to complement it by how do you truly measure the wealth of a nation? And there's 5 forms of capital which really make far more sense. One of them is built capital, social capital, natural capital, human capital, absolutely critical for most countries in the world, and financial capital. If you look at those 5 forms of capital, it gives you a much, much better view of whether we're moving on a sustainable or unsustainable path. The question is, what's the fungibility between those 5 forms of capital? We've clearly got to get rid of damaging subsidies. They don't help the poor, they hurt the federal treasury, and there's over $1 trillion a year now between energy, transportation and agricultural subsidies. We don't pay the true cost of most natural resources. We need to internalise the externalities, the environmental and social costs, say associated with coal. So we clearly need to look at how we price commodities. And when we look at biodiversity and ecosystems and their services, we've got to understand not only what the economic value is, but also what is the social, non-economic value. When we look at the economic value, what's the market value, what trades in the marketplace, but what also is the non-market. I've got a slide on that. Absolutely critical to look at the whole value, economic and non-economic, when we make decisions about biodiversity. Clearly, 1 billion people have no access to modern energy. They absolutely must get access to modern energy, even if some of it is fossil fuel. But in many developing countries that are off-grid, renewable energy, small-scale renewables can be a very good way to try and meet that. But the big challenge is, how do we go to a low-carbon economy? How do we reduce our use of fossil fuels? More renewable energy. If we use fossil fuel, how do you capture the carbon before it goes into the atmosphere? And an interesting issue, can we actually get to a low-carbon economy without at least a part of that energy being provided by nuclear? And it has to be on the table to be discussed. The longer we keep using fossil fuel, the more we're going to lock ourselves into an economy for the next 50 or 60 years that is unsustainable. We've clearly got to make the transition now and avoid some level of lock-in. The governments of the world have agreed that we should try and limit greenhouse gas emissions such that the eventual change in the Earth's temperature is no more than 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial. Well, to do that, as you can see from that chart, you have a 50-50 shot if we stabilise at 400 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. And what I mean by CO2 equivalent is you add up the radiative effect of carbon dioxide and all the other greenhouse gases, that's methane, nitrous oxide, fluorocarbons, tropospheric ozone, and actually we're already at 500 parts per million. But luckily we've polluted the atmosphere also with sulphur, and we have sulfate aerosols in the atmosphere, and to a large extent they're partially offsetting the effect of the human-induced greenhouse gases. So to some degree we're effectively around 400 parts per million of CO2 today. There, in my opinion, is no hope in hell of meeting a 2-degree target. I would argue we're on a pathway of between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius with some pretty severe implications. Is it technically feasible to make a 2-degree world? Yes. Is it likely politically? No. And so we should start thinking about how would we try and mitigate to get as close to 2 degrees as possible, but recognise we might have to adapt to a 5-degree world. And this is actually in the latest IPCC. And what we looked at here, fundamentally, there's not a pointer, unfortunately. The bottom little blue line on the left-hand side is if we really aggressively try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we may actually be able to stabilise just below 2 degrees Celsius. I just don't see we've got the political will, even though we do actually have the technological capability. The orange line is the more likely scenario, unfortunately, which is still continued reliance on fossil fuel. So we then ask, and that shows you what temperature it would lead to. So it would be about 1 degree relative to 1990. You have to add another 0.6 degrees relative to pre-industrial. But effectively, if you look at unique and threatened species, you see, even by the blue line, you're already in the medium to high impact on biodiversity. Not so bad for extreme weather, but we still start to see more extreme weather. Types of things you saw in the Philippines a couple of days ago. Distributional issues. The poor people in poor countries are already going to be hit by even a 1 and a bit degrees Celsius. Right? The global aggregate, there's some benefits in the north, not so much a global aggregate issue, and probably won't get large-scale singular events like a reversal of ocean circulation, the melting of the Greenland ice cap or Antarctic. But if you're on the high scenario, the one over that, we're basically screwed. I mean, fundamentally, we're in bad shape. It will threaten water security, food security, human security, major implications for biodiversity. So if we're on that top line, we're really in a bad situation. People say let's just adapt. Yes, we're going to have to adapt anyway. The climate's already changing. Future change is absolutely inevitable. We can limit the future change, but there are physical, behavioural and technological limits to adaptation, and there's also financial limitations. So adaptation is essential. There's only so much you can do. Why are we driving change? Well, it doesn't matter if it's climate change or whether it's biodiversity. The indirect drivers of change are economic, our economic system, global growth, demographic change, not only the total number of people, but the rural to urban mix matters, age distribution matters, gender distribution matters, there's social political consideration, cultural and religious, and science and technology. Science and technology can be good or bad, same as different cultural issues, depends what sort of philosophy you have. But with respect to biodiversity, it manifests itself into habitat change, change a tropical forest into agriculture, change a wetland into a shrimp farm, climate change a major direct driver, invasive species, accidental and purposeful from one part of the world to another, overexploitation, we overfish our oceans, 30% of the oceans are totally overfished at the moment, and nutrients and pollution. Nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur all lead to a loss of biodiversity. It's not just losing species, we're undermining the provisioning services that we rely on, the provisionings of crop, livestock, fisheries, water supply. We're undermining the regulating services, climate control, pollination, detoxification. We're undermining cultural services, the aesthetic, spiritual, inspirational, the recreation, what you get, and the underlying supporting services. So when we lose biodiversity, we're actually undermining the very basis of sustainable development. And what we've done, I chair a UK national ecosystem. We said, okay, who actually makes decisions in government? Yeah, the head of state often, but the most important person is always the finance minister. And what we talked about is, you can't talk about losing species, it just doesn't resonate with the finance minister. The cultural issues normally don't resonate with the finance, the economy does. So what we've actually done is to say, to what degree can we demonstrate that our ecosystem services actually have value? So within the UK, we looked at a different set of ecosystem services: pollination, crops, wild species, meaningful places, so not everything is a thing, climate regulation, hazards, etc. What did these services give to people? Well, they gave food, fibre, energy, recreation, inspiration, important from a spiritual, religious perspective, etc. We turned it in, we recognise you need other capital inputs, too long to go into it, but we then said, what are the economic values of all these services? What are the importance for health, including mental health, and how important was it from a shared social value? Things you can't always put an economic value on. So we went, and actually the Treasury in England has taken this system and said, fine, we actually now need to think through not only the economic implications of a change in our ecosystem, but what are the implications for things such like mental health and shared social values. So we're making some progress. Better government's absolutely essential. It doesn't matter whether you're at the national level or the global level. It doesn't matter if you're in the government or in the private sector. We must have better governance. We've got to eliminate or minimise the power of the vested interest, who love the status quo. They're making a lot of money out of the status quo. So why do they want to change? The mining companies, some of the big energy companies, basically. So how can you at least try and put some limits? But at the local level, public hearings and social audits give at least some level of voice to marginalised groups. At the national level, parliamentary press oversight. No one's got a really good answer to how you do it globally at the moment, basically, but there's no trust and there's no respect when you have global negotiations these days. They're both in rather short supply. And each government has a problem. They've got a Ministry of Water, often, a Ministry of Natural Resources, a Ministry of Agriculture, Energy, Treasury. To deal with these issues, you have to work right across the siloed structures of most governments. So you want to understand how you have sectoral departments, but you also got to work through how do you make sure they're all interlinked and they understand the relationship between the different government departments. Grassroots, lots of good sustainable communities. They manage their natural resources, they manage their water, their food, their energy. The question is, from those examples of small communities, to what degree are their examples replicable, and to what degree can you actually scale them up? It's an interesting question. And clearly, education, absolutely fundamental. There's no way we can actually make progress without good education. Also, there's an issue of training leaders and people in government and in the business community. So training is essential, education absolutely critical. We need obviously inter and multidisciplinary research, and I've got a couple of slides on that, and we need to assess knowledge. And we've got to have much more coordinated assessments. I mean, I have shared the international assessments on climate, biodiversity and agriculture. We've got to bring all of those together in a much more better way. Time to act is clearly now because of the inertia of the socio-economic system. Many of the changes in the environment will either take a long time to reverse or irreversible. There are signs of uncertainty, but we know enough to act. We can manage in an adaptive management the challenges that we face, and this is important both now and future generations. So what's the international process? Well, the time when we first started to bring together in a meaningful way at the global level environment and development was the Brundtland Report. That led then to the 1992 Rio conference and the so-called First Earth Summit conference. What happened soon after that was one recognised in many parts of the world no progress was being made on development, and so they put together the so-called Millennium Development Goals in 2000 with a global action plan, and I've got one slide on that in a second. Ban Ki-moon then last year established a high-level panel to say, look, the MDGs finish in 2015, what should the post-2015 development framework look like? He also asked Jeff Sachs to put together the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, of which Monash is actually the hub for Australia and the Pacific. Also then, when we went to Rio, in Rio +20, we talked about the future we want, and they established an intergovernmental open working group to advise the General Assembly, and I've got a slide on that, And very, very recently, they put an expert financing panel together. How do you finance this particular agenda? So with the Millennium Development Goals, there are 8 of them. You can read them at the top. Lots of progress in some ways. So several of them, many of them have been met at the global level. But as it says, it hides very significant regional and domestic distributional issues. There's more and more inequality in the world together between countries and within countries than we've almost ever had, basically. A good strength of the MDGs, a limited number, 8. Also, they were quantitative and they were measurable, but they were globally aggregated. So many of them are being met just because of the advances in China, whereas many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have truly been left behind. But a set of weaknesses only apply to developing countries. They didn't look at the synergies and trade-offs amongst those issues at the top, and it was short-termism. They didn't ask the question, if we achieve this goal by 2015, is it sustainable in the long term? And that was a major weakness. So where are they going on the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, clearly the overall goal is poverty eradication. What does that mean for a developed country? Well, it's the equivalent for us to think about the whole concept of human well-being, community livability, environmental sustainability, and economic prosperity. The definition of poverty is simply not income. It includes being free from hunger, being healthy and educated, having voice and the ability to participate in decision making, being secure, access to reproductive services, and having individual or community property rights. So when we talk about eradicating poverty, income is only one small but important component of eliminating poverty, and that is indeed the debate in New York at the moment. So far in the Open Working Group, they've already discussed how do you conceptualise SDGs. What do we mean by poverty eradication? I've just talked about that. They've talked about issues such as food security, water and sanitation, employment, social protection, the role of youth, education, culture, and health. They're the ones they've already discussed. What they're going to talk about between this next week and next February is this very, very long list, and I'm not going to go into it. But what do we mean by inclusive economic growth? How do we look at the macroeconomic policies around it? What should the energy strategies be? How do you have global partnerships for achieving sustainability? What are the special conditions of the lesser developing countries? How do we bring human rights and global governance into the debate? What do we mean by sustainable consumption and production? Promote equity, including social equity, gender equity, women's empowerment. These are all issues they'll discuss between now and February, and then they'll start to actually debate what should the sustainability goals be. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network has already come up with their suggestion of 10 goals. You can read them, I won't go through them, but as you can see, it goes from poverty, gender equality and social inclusion, improve agricultural systems, secure ecosystem services, and Carl's trying to tell me to shut up, but I'll carry on. We've got the MDGs. Dave Griggs put a science paper together. He's putting a more sophisticated second version, a longer version. But then there are the goals I've just mentioned on the SDSN, and the high-level panel, co-chaired by the heads of state of the UK, Liberia, and Indonesia, came up with 12 goals. Very much a consistency right across. So we've got a foundation to start to look at. UNDP put together something called the My World Survey. As of June, they'd surveyed 800,000 participants. They gave them 16 topics and said prioritise them. The top 5, good education, better healthcare. Number 3 is always a challenge. Then better job opportunities, access to clean water. Very consistent with what's being thought about, except for number 3, in New York at the moment. So what are some of the challenges? What do we mean by universality? What sort of goal would you have that brings in Australia, United Kingdom, US, and China and India, and also Mali, Nepal, etc. So lots of thought about what we mean by universality. We need to limit to 10, and yet there's 50 big issues. So how do you limit it to 10, but recognise the interlinkages and issues we have never dealt with, basically? How do you look at the issues such as financing, technology transfer, debt relief, intellectual property rights, trade reform and capacity building? So some big crunchy issues we're going to effectively have to look at. Science can play a really crucial issue. It's essential for informed policy making, but it's clearly not it doesn't give you everything, so it's just one input basically. We clearly need multi and interdisciplinary programs at the national level. We must bring together the natural sciences, the social sciences, economics, law, technology, etc. It's absolutely vital. We now do have a new program called Future Earth, and I've got a couple of slides on it. We need really good assessments that bring together the scientific, technical and economic aspect. Intergovernmental panel on climate change, which I once chaired, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which currently I'm the Vice Chair. We need to bring indigenous knowledge together with modern knowledge, it's two more, and we need to involve decision makers right throughout the whole process, basically. And actually, I think I will skip the details of Future Earth and IPCC, but I'll leave this slide set behind, and effectively you can look at it at pleasure. There's just a couple of things that says what Future Earth is, and maybe the only one I would show then is the one that shows we're going to fundamentally, how do we all work together? How do we co-design research? How do we co-produce knowledge? And how do we co-disseminate knowledge amongst the policy community, science funders, research community, business and wider society, and how do we implement it together? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Bob Watson. Let me introduce now our second presenter. Professor John Quates is a leading expert on climate change, water, sustainability and corporate social responsibility. Professor Quates is currently a professorial fellow at Monash University and has held senior positions in Climate Works Australia, the Monash Sustainability Institute and the National Sustainability Council. He's on the Leadership Council for the UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network and is named one of the 100 Global Sustainability Leaders in 2012 by ABC Carbon Express. John Quates.
Well, thanks very much, Lynette. And can I start by thanking Jackie True and your team for organising this fantastic workshop. And I did come to the workshop you had earlier, the Show and Tell Research Workshop for Arts, and I thought that was a great model. And today I'm very excited to be part of this collaboration more broadly across Monash to see how we can really fulfil the aims of the Sustainable Development Goals with better research and education here at Monash. I'm going to talk about today particularly about the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This was launched by the UN Secretary General last August, and in launching the new initiative, the Secretary General said that this would be a new independent network of research centres and universities to help find solutions to these big challenges in sustainable development. And as he said, and as Sir Bob pointed out, the post-2015 objectives are going to help the world to focus on the vital challenges of sustainable development. But this network, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, is going to be an innovative way to involve universities, also scientific research centres and business together in solving these issues. Now, what are the 4 key objectives of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network? First, to provide expert advice and support to the development of the post-2015 agenda. Partly it's advice on what the goals might be, but also what the targets might be, and very importantly, how they might be implemented.